Conventional wisdom celebrates the United States as a place where anyone, regardless of their resources, can climb the economic ranks if they work hard enough. But in truth, economic mobility in the US has declined precipitously, both in relation to other countries and in comparison to our past. The percentage of children who grew up to earn more than their parents has declined from about 90% for children born in 1940 to just 50% for children born in the 1980s. Economic inequality in the US is higher today than at any time since the Gilded Age at the dawn of the 20th century. The lack of mobility and the loss of faith in the American compact that each successive generation will do better than the one before may be the biggest single economic and social challenge faced in our country today. How to address it has been the topic of fierce public and political debates, which has divided the public and, generally speaking, has not reversed the downward trends in mobility and equality. This may seem like an unusual topic for a book club on longevity to delve into, but these topics are very much intertwined with the core questions about who gets to live healthier or longer lives and who doesn't, what our longer lives will be like as we age. Unfortunately, we have a great guest to lead an important discussion with us today. Natalie Foster is the president and co-founder of the Economic Security Project and an Aspen Institute fellow. She previously founded the Sharing Economy Community Peers and co-founded Rebuild the Dream with Van Jones and served as digital director for President Obama's Organizing for America. And she's author of the fascinating new book, The Guarantee: Inside the Fight for America's New Economy. Welcome, Natalie. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Ken. It's my pleasure to be here.
So if people haven't already noticed, I am soloing today as my co-host Martha Devi is out, but she'll be back for sure for our next event. And as always, we are taking your questions starting right now. Please put your questions in the Q&A and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So Natalie, let's just start off a little bit about you. I read in the book you're the daughter of a Kansas pastor. How does someone get from being a daughter of a Kansas pastor to an author of a book about rethinking the American economic system?
That's such a great question, Ken. Well, I did grow up in Kansas. We lived in a parsonage, which gets relevant later as to like sort of my radicalizing moment around the American economy. That's the church home. So we didn't own a home, and but it was a home of community and love, and that was my childhood. And I got to college, and this phrase was very important to me, became very important to me, which is justice is what love looks like in public. And that would help me understand how I wanted to spend my life's work. Yes, love, and also the fight for justice. And that this nation can live up to its ideal of a true multiracial democracy where everyone can thrive and succeed if it chooses to, right? And that is what justice could look like. That is love in public. So that's what I've spent my life doing. And then frankly, the book, I think of myself more as an advocate for economic security. And the book was written because it was the book I needed to read. I had done, I'd been heads down, focused on my work around an economic security and an income floor. And I realized how much progress we'd made. And, I've been in politics about 25 years, long enough to know there's a lot you try that doesn't work. Social change, there's a lot you try that doesn't take off. And then when something does, it's extraordinary. So I'd been heads down, the work had taken off, and I looked around and realized it was not just us. It was a whole host of economic guarantees, from family care to housing to healthcare, and that I wanted to document that progress and the people who had made that happen, because it gave me hope. And so I wrote the book I needed to read.
So you just said something that I have to follow up on. You said your radicalizing moment. What happened?
Well, I was a young organizer. I was working for the Sierra Club. I was in my 20s. I had no family inheritance to fall back on, but I was making a good salary. I was living in Atlanta, and it was my dream to own a home because I'd fully bought into the story that is how one has stability in this economy. And I wasn't reading the Wall Street Journal. I knew very little about money and personal, finance, but I knew that I this was a dream because, like I said, my family hadn't. So I closed on my small bungalow in Atlanta, March of 2008.
Mm.
And you know what happened right
Yeah,
there, April of
yeah.
8. It would be the Great Recession. 10 million homes would be lost. Half of Black and Latino family wealth would evaporate overnight through the course of the Great Recession. And these were all policy choices that we'd made as a nation. And I decided that we have to do better. And as I dug into American history, I realized we had done better. There were times in American history, like the economy is not like the weather. It is not something that just happens to us. And the economy I'd grown up in did not have to be the one I left my children. We did not have to make the same set of decisions that was like total faith in the market, zero faith in government, and telling people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, right? That there was another way. That is sort of the personal piece that led me to this work.
Well, you didn't finish the personal story. What happened to the house?
Well, I was a lucky one. I held on to it. I actually, at that point, was recruited. That would be the year that Barack Obama was elected. I moved to DC to run his digital team. Um, and I rented the house out. It lost half its value over the course of the next several years. And I just held on to it, made the payments, covered most of them through rent, and then was able to sell at the same price I bought it for. So,
Mm.
I was a lucky one, but certainly the promise of that being a source of security did not manifest in my life.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us about the guarantee. So that's the title of your book. Um, People are probably familiar with pieces of the guarantee, but you're talking about a whole sort of ecosystem that's built around guarantees. So tell us what you mean by that.
Yeah, I am talking about an economy that is oriented toward human flourishing. That is the goal. And the way we do that is by creating a stable floor, right? Not a ceiling, but a floor that every American family can stand on and start their lives and build lives on top of lives of dignity, agency, freedom, right? These are the things people deserve, but they're not possible if one is living paycheck to paycheck and in a deeply insecure experience. And so I'm talking the guarantee of housing, of healthcare, of higher education, the guarantee of family care, both for our babies and our elders and those with disabilities amongst us. I'm talking about the guarantee of a good job, the guarantee of income, which is my work, and the guarantee of an inheritance known as a baby bond. There are actually states that have done every single one of these. There are models for how we get there, and taken together, it's a new economic paradigm that I think can replace the last 40 years of trickle-down economics, that it's an evolution of American capitalism that supports families by creating stability.
All right. So Natalie, um, that's a lot. That's a whole fairly radical rethink of the American economic system. Um, so what can you sort of walk us through some of the components of it and what that might look like?
Yeah.
And I've read the book, and it's a great summary of the guarantee. But I hope you might sort of share the outlines of it with the audience, who most of them won't have read it.
Yeah. So I'm making the case that, businesses in America thrive on guarantees. That when you operate a company here, you have the guarantee of the patent system, the guarantee of the court system, right? The central bank is created to guarantee our monetary policy and keep it
Yeah.
stable. And that is, if you're a shareholder, you are guaranteed to not be held liable for any malfeasance that a corporation might do. These are important guarantees for the economic growth and the ingenuity and the innovation that exists in America. And I'm arguing we should extend those guarantees to the true engine of the American economy, which are families and workers across this country. And that same experience of freedom to take a risk and ingenuity and creativity would be much more widely distributed if we did that. So your question is, how do we do it, right? And there are a lot of models, right? The book traces models that are being created in cities and states that show how we would do something like guarantee housing or guarantee long-term care. Why don't we talk about the long-term care piece, just to give an example of how one might think about it. Right now, it's left up entirely to the private market. And I have traveled around the country talking to people who are incredibly stressed out about how they are going to pay for and find long-term care for their parents, or for them when the time comes. And of course, none of us know
So,
when that's going
so
to
I'm
be.
sorry, just to
Yeah.
interrupt you a second. So the background for this is that there's a private insurance market for long-term care. By and large, it's failed, right?
Yeah.
So it is much smaller than it used to be because it didn't work economically. So that's a little bit of the context for your inquiry. I just want to sort of share
That's
that.
right. And then if you don't have long-term care insurance, which is most people, then you pay for it out of pocket, right? And
Yeah.
that is like how that is the American solution. Figure out how to pay for this incredibly expensive thing. And we know that families can't afford to spend any, cannot afford it now, and certainly can't afford it if prices go up. And we also know that care providers can make wages that rarely allow for them to have one job in order to take care of their family, right? That it is often informal, insecure work, that is a real challenge to raise your own family. So the market's broken, right? And
Yeah.
the way we solve that is by government saying, this is important. This is important to families. It's important for families who work, right? The people in the sandwich generation need to be able to know their loved ones are taken care of. And so we're going to support a market. In Washington State, there's a model called WA Cares. It is a long-term care social insurance program. Workers of all stripes put money in. We pool our risk, right? We create the capital that seeds the fund. And then when someone needs long-term care, they're able to pull money out. So it's creating a way of supporting families who need it and supporting the wages of caregivers who give it. Now, one could still go find their own caregiver and pay for it. That is always an option, but you have a floor that no one can fall below in this model. And that's the type of thing that could be exported nationwide if we decide this is something that we're going to do, that we're
So
going to.
just a little bit, let me make sure I understand the wash. You say walk cares? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, uh, Describe a little bit more about how it works. And if I could ask you to drill down, so there's already a question from the audience asking about sort of how are there states that are essentially creating the guarantee, at least in small parts. You started talking about Washington State, and maybe you can sort of elaborate on this specific example and maybe others like it that are states or the laboratory of innovation or whatever the phrase is. What are they doing?
They are. They are the laboratories of innovation and the laboratories of democracy, right? That's the phrase. And that's actually deeply important because the connection between economic security and democracy is so relevant today. So what are they doing? The world is actually filled with models like this that are inspiring. Let me give you an example, some more. In Maryland, Montgomery County, Maryland, if anyone is here from Washington, D.C.
I am.
All right, okay. Ken, are
Yeah.
you in Montgomery County?
No, I'm in Washington, D.C.,
That's great.
which has
Right,
nothing.
right in the
But,
district.
yeah.
Well, in Montgomery County, Maryland, the housing authority there said, you know what, we're going to take housing is something that we've left entirely up to the private market, and it's failed us. Rents are unaffordable. The number of units that we have built has declined precipitously to the point where we need somewhere between 4 and 6 million new units just to keep up with modern demand. And so we are going to, alongside the private market, we're going to use our financing authority to build more housing for middle income Marylanders. They procured land right on the transit line. I think it's the Silver Line. Is that right, Ken? That goes out to Montgomery. Anyway,
The red line and the silver line. Yeah.
there you go. And so it's very easy to get to, and it's kept off the market so that rents are stable for middle income Marylanders. Now you can choose to buy your own home, or you have an option that starts to create a floor and gets to a housing guarantee in America. So that's just one example of where states are starting to do this. New Mexico is another example. Recently, in the last few years, they passed a constitutional right to childcare, to early learning for early young New Mexicans 0 to 5. and are figuring out how they guarantee that across the state. So there are a number of places starting to do this, and taken together, it creates a paradigm shift away from the old paradigm, right? That tells us that we have to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps, and government has no role in ensuring that there's some floor of economic security.
So I'm going to do a shameless self-promotion on that. So the podcast that I host for Stanford called Century Lives, we did an episode on New Mexico and Constitutional Amendment 1, which passed, I guess, about a year and a half ago, providing early childhood education as a personal right. It's actually a very inspiring story. If you want to hear it, you can find it on our podcast. But
Ken, I hope you put the link here because I want to hear it too.
Oh yeah, you should. It's a great story. I mean, now I'm going to go off script here. The people we interviewed there and the fight. I mean, the fight for Constitutional Amendment 1, and this may cut in different directions, took like 15 years.
Yeah.
Was inspiring, but also hard to make progress in one state.
Well, so that is actually the experience across all the guarantees. I start tracking this work in 2008. It's basically my argument, and it's not just mine. Take Gary Gersel, who's written the definitive piece, The Rise and Fall of Neoliberalism, that came out this year. He had an Ezra Klein podcast earlier this year. And it's his argument, too, that in 2008 is basically the end of an old economic paradigm. The emperor had no clothes, right? It was clear that neoliberalism had not, or trickle-down economics had not lived up to its promise of widespread economic security, and frankly, even of economic growth, that it had really not done the things it promised it would do throughout the 80s and the 90s and the aughts. And we've been in the wilderness, the interregnum, since. But in 2008, people started building. And they started to lay the seeds of something that would be different. It would go through 12. It would live through 16 with Brexit, with two candidates that looked unlike any candidate we've seen in my lifetime. And by that, I mean Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, two populist candidates arguing for a very different economy than what we'd seen over the last 40 and 50 years, that things were in a real shift. And during that period, during this interregnum, the builders were laying the seeds. And so there is a way for them to bloom now if we decide this is, the direction we want to head in. So I just think your point about longevity and how long this work takes is really important. And the other thing I'll say here is you never know the moment when it can move forward, right? It's the old adage, it's chance and the prepared mind. That is when there's great progress. So the prepared mind, and then the moment like the pandemic, and things could move forward in a very different way. And that's what you have to hold in your heart if you're a builder, that at some point there will be a shift and we'll be ready for it.
Yeah, I want to come back to the pandemic and what the legislation that happened and didn't happen about it stands for. But there was actually a question. You mentioned neoliberal policies. There's actually a question from the audience asking, what role do you feel economists have played in keeping neoliberal policies in place? And if you might help me on this, can you define neoliberal and sort of the structure and sort of to the question of the audience, like why has it existed even when it's become calcified and sort of the notion of the American opportunity has seemed to decline for so many people?
So in the 40s and 50s and 60s, there was a movement of people who did not like the role government was playing in the markets at the time, in the post-war economy, the New Deal era that frankly built the American middle class and showed it was possible to have more widespread prosperity. Now, it was largely for white families at the time, families like mine. My family was in Oklahoma and really benefited from things like the GI Bill, from small business loans that allowed my family to start a furniture store in little town in Oklahoma. And this movement of people were saying, we want a different thing, we want more freedom, and started to lay the groundwork. They met at the Mont Pelerin Society and wrote down a statement of aims and said, government should be out, market should leave, and people need, market should lead, and people should have the freedom, to do what they will. And so they started to move that thinking into the academy, into the legal profession, into think tanks, and into media and journalism. And it would be the election of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that would move this idea, once seen as radical, but now seen as the way the economy works, into the mainstream. And we would start to make policies with that rubric. Total faith in the market, zero faith in government, make it as small as we can to drown it in the bathtub, and then tell people it's their job to figure everything out on their own. That it doesn't matter if everyone has this problem and therefore it is structural, things like care, right, which is a deeply broken system that everyone experiences, that there should be no structural solutions to that. Tell people it's their own problem. That's how I define this neoliberal, this sort of trickle down era of policymaking. And it's a paradigm because it's really how both sides of the aisle governed. And it was sort of understood that the economy, I came of age thinking the economy is like the weather, right? It's just a thing that happens to us, and there's sort of no shift in the way we govern. We can turn, the edges here and there, but that's basically it. And in fact, I've come to learn the economy is not like the weather. It's a series of decisions. It's a house we're building with plans we lay and decisions we make, and then the outcomes we get from those decisions. And that in fact, there, have been very different ways of economic policymaking in the past. And I'd argue we're about to enter an era that breaks from the last 40 or 50 years.
So we've talked about some of the elements of the guarantee. We talked briefly about housing. We've talked about long-term care. We talked about early childhood education. But perhaps sort of the front man, if you will, for this idea of the guarantee is universal basic income. Can you talk about what that is and how it's being implemented and tested around the country right now?
Yeah. And I like the way you're framing that. I hadn't thought of it like that. So this has been my entry point to this work. I got really interested in a universal basic income about 10 years ago, thinking both how the labor market would be dramatically impacted by technological change and AI, as we are now living in the midst of, but also the persistent poverty that we've seen throughout the last 50 years, right? Dr. King wrote his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? And in that book, he is talking about how we abolish poverty. And we have not moved the needle at all since he wrote that book, right? That it's a persistent problem throughout the last several decades, but also because American families are increasingly precarious, right? That 56% of Americans cannot pull together $1,000 in an emergency if they needed to. That gets even harder for families of color, right? That we know that Black families have, that white families on average have 10 times the wealth that a Black family has in America. And the numbers, right, go on and on. And so one of the solutions to this is to create an income floor through cash. And that this is an old idea. Thomas Paine talked about it as he imagined the agrarian economy that America was building. And as I said, Dr. King talked about it. And so as we looked at these problems about a decade ago, we thought, this is really something that's modern. This is something we should build. And so started to research in Alaska, where there is a dividend for every man, woman, and child paid out annually that has no strings attached, no forms you fill out or how you spent the money, no long lines to stand in or like phone calls you have to make. It's just debited into your account. We looked at the tribal nations around the country who are using cash transfers to support their next generations and the young. And we thought, this is an idea that we need to test out in America, right? It's happening internationally. Every developed country has something like a child allowance, but let's do this in America. And so it was at a meeting like this. I sat next to Michael Tubbs. He is, of course, a young Stanford student who went on to become one of the youngest mayors in American history in Stockton, California. And he said, Natalie, I read Dr. King's last book. I want to try this out in Stockton. And we did too. So we partnered up and he launched one of the first modern demonstrations of this idea. So here's what it meant. For 125 families in Stockton, no matter how much they earned or didn't earn, $500 were debited into their account or a check showed up in their mailbox each month. It was money they could count on month after month after month. And so what it meant for a woman named Adriana, who is part of a cash transfer program, is that her kids love to play soccer. And every fall it was very stressful because their family just made enough to pay rent, to keep the, roof over their kids' head and to put food on the table. And soccer's expensive, the whole kit, the cleats, the shin guards, all of it. And it was stressful to her. And she would have to kind of roll it out month by month to get her kids the updated, gear they needed. When she got the check as part of the guaranteed income demonstration, she was able to get her kids the full kit at the beginning of the season, the shin guards, the cleats, all of it. And she felt like she could provide for her kids and had the agency she needed to do it. So it's that story is emblematic of what it meant in people's lives, but also across the board, well-being went up. Things like birth rates went up, birth weights went up, preventative doctor's visits to dentist and the doctor went up, and stress went down. People reported being able to sleep through the night, right? So that was Stockton. It spread like wildfire around the country, and there are now 150 of these demonstrations of what a guaranteed income could look like in America. And it would go ahead.
Let me actually bring a question in from the audience on this, because I think it's probably a question and I have a couple questions about sort of what we know so far. But the question is probably reflective of what people want to ask about is, how do you pay for this? So you use the example, probably the biggest example is the permanent fund in Alaska, of which people would die if they thought it was being used as an example of universal basic income, even though it is. That's paid for, that's created out of the North Shore, the North Sea oil, not North Sea, Prudhoe Bay oil. That's created a permanent fund. It works because the economics of that makes sense in the context of a very small population compared to a lot of money. So the question is, like, how do you pay for this in small scale in a place like Stockton? And then how do you scale that to be meaningful beyond what is ultimately right now fairly small demonstration projects?
Yeah, those are great questions. In Alaska, it's noteworthy that the dividends are incredibly popular and they're seen as, right, the commonly owned wealth, right? That
They're
we
seen as a natural right there, right? Because they think they've earned it, right?
Yes, because that's how it's framed and offered to them. And it has existed across both Republican and Democratic governors. So it is truly transpartisan in that way. I think that, the way the demonstrations like Stockton, and I'm telling you, they are all over the country. Little towns like Wausau, Wisconsin, and big cities like Chicago and LA, suburbs, different communities they focus on. It's been extraordinary to see something like this be replicated over and over. Those tend to be funded by philanthropy and some, after the pandemic, some public dollars, but they're largely understood to be a demonstration of policy, right? That's something that should be scaled federally. And in the pandemic, we did that. We passed the expanded child tax credit. And in 2021, after we did that, like weeks after we passed the expanded child tax credit in the American Rescue Plan, 92% of parents in America just received a check. It was about $250 a kid. It was debited directly into their account with the exact same spirit of what Michael Tubbs was doing in Stockton, trusting the person to use the money to be the arbiters of their own financial lives. No strings attached, very efficient in that way, both trust-based and efficient. And it's a blueprint for how you would begin a guaranteed income in America. And it's done through the tax code, which is just a modernizing and expansion of of the child tax credit, which is a very, very popular tax credit. Every member of one party voted for it, and every member of another party voted against it. So it is, and unfortunately, it ended. But since
Mhm.
then, there have been the states have moved on child tax credits. You have red states, purple states, and blue states. Governors there who've said, I want this in my state. I know it's important to support families, for local economies, and for economic growth. And we've doubled the number of states since 2021 that have a child tax credit on the books. And I absolutely believe whether it's 4 years, 6 years, 12 years from now, we'll have that expanded child tax credit again, and it will be just as popular as Social Security is today, because the Social Security was once in the exact same shoes, right? It was a radical idea taken from post-war Germany that was a
Yeah.
small payroll tax to end poverty among seniors.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the arguments against it is sort of the moral hazard associated with um, free money and the disincentive to work. You cite, for instance, I mean, some of the um, evidence you cite in the book. You mentioned Give Directly, which is actually an amazing project. I'll put a plug in for them that does overseas, gives money instead of aid, money directly to recipients. And it's got great data around it. But domestically, it's more controversial. What do you think about the argument about that? It's a disincentive of work, in which the data has been a little bit mixed on it, at least as I understand.
The data has been clear. People want to work in this country. So one of the non-obvious findings that we had in Stockton was that people who received $500 a month found full-time work at double the rate than the people who didn't. And here's why. They had time to invest in themselves. They had time to go to a job interview for a job that they might not get, to get a certificate, a training program that they
Yeah.
needed to get the job they wanted, to look for a job that was like near their child's school and ended at 3 so they could pick their kids up and not have to pay an arm and a leg for childcare. Like all the things, the decisions you can make when you have economic security were then more widely spread amongst this community in Stockton. And the same is true with the natural experiment of the child tax credit. Parents continued to work. It's not enough money to quit. It is by far not enough money to raise a family in America, but it is enough money to change lives and to create just a beginning of a guarantee that creates the security, allowing families to make, to live lives on their own terms. And so
So there's a question.
yeah. So,
No,
so
please finish.
that's really where the data is, as it comes to work. And the other thing I want to say here that's important
Yeah.
is that for decades we have seen the number of small businesses decline in America, right? It's a real concern if you believe in American dynamism and entrepreneurialism, that small businesses are like an indicator of this, and it's declined for all kinds of reasons. It's really hard to start a business. It's really expensive. The markets are so concentrated that they're tipped in favor against the little guy. In the pandemic, when we invested in families through the child tax credit, through stimulus checks, we saw small businesses go up by 21%. And that has continued to be the trend year after year after year. When people have a bit more risk capital, they take those risks. And when they don't, they don't.
Yeah. One question from the audience. What is your position that providing everyone with extra cash could lead to inflation? As demand for goods and services increases, prices might rise, offsetting the benefits of receiving a UBI payment.
Yeah, I think that any sort of cash transfer needs to go hand in hand with market reform. I am a strong proponent in antitrust and anti-monopoly, and we need a reinvigoration of that in America, because it is true that, if prices go up, then the cash doesn't really help the families. At the same time, we also know that this era of inflation we're living in is caused by a whole set of factors, including an unprecedented war in the Ukraine, a supply chain crisis that was caused from that, all of the shutting down and opening up in COVID that shifted the supply chains, and frankly, corporate behavior that saw an opportunity and went for it. That is why we saw the rising prices in America. And in fact, the money we invested in families was what allowed the lowest income earners amongst us to actually deal with the rising cost of living. And so I think it's like important that they're paired together, but it's all, this is why I thought, this is what led me to write the book I wrote. I didn't just write a book about guaranteed income, though that is what I spend most of my time thinking about. I wrote a book about the guarantees because unless we deal with the rising cost of higher education, right, which has gone up 301% for people my age, if we deal with the rising cost of housing and healthcare, then we never will have a truly stable, we will never have an economy that can create stability for a widespread number of Americans. And so I think it's important that these things are paired. At the same time, I think a guaranteed income could be turned on tomorrow. We now have the blueprint, right? We've passed it at the federal level. So we know how to do it. And like you called it, the front man, I think that's a good way of thinking about it.
So let's talk about some of the other members of the band. If I can continue the bad analogy, the talk about housing. I mean, housing is a big topic of top of mind for a lot of people. What's a housing guarantee look like?
Yeah, it's a real question, I think, right now. I think there's three components. One is production. We have to put more units online, and there's all kinds of ink, spilled on why, I'm piping in from California, and we are in the midst of an incredible housing crisis that gets worse year after year after year after year.
Yeah.
And why is that? Well, there's a number of reasons. Ezra Klein has a book coming out in March about this very topic, right? A liberalism that can build. And so there's a lot spent there, but production is really important. And we need to be building 4 to 6 million houses and then more. That will bring the price down. Within that, I think we should build more like Montgomery County, Maryland, which creates sort of a floor within the broader housing market that shapes the market, right? When there is competition saying, here are rental units for us, X amount that a working family in Maryland can afford, that shifts the whole housing market in the right direction. But a second thing is we have to preserve affordable housing, existing affordable housing. And this country has disinvested in affordable housing and public housing dramatically over the last 40 years. We built it with some of the shoddiest materials 40 years ago. We have not invested in the upkeep and the maintenance. And so we're starting from a place very different than countries like Austria, right? Or Singapore, places that have or Tokyo, places that have solved this problem because they have invested differently. And then the third thing I think we have to do is protect renters. And the most vulnerable in the housing market are the people who rent. And so supporting renters, so building more, supporting renters, and preserving the affordable housing are the components to a housing guarantee.
So some might argue that those two things might be a little bit in conflict, perhaps not totally in conflict, but the idea of um, uh, supporting renters, make it harder to evict them or raise rates are actually a significant disincentive in the marketplace to build. How do you sort of square those two things together? Because you see market distortions in places which have limits on how much you can charge, non-market rates.
You also see other market distortions, to your excellent question, that say, here in this city, you can only build a single family home.
Oh, yeah, that's nuts. Yeah, of course. Yeah, yeah.
So
I mean, if
think
you go to your point, you go to Singapore, everything's a high rise, right? So
that's right. And literally, I think, I didn't realize this till I started writing the book. The exclusionary zoning, right, or the single family home zoning meant that you couldn't, even if you believed in that vision of a city, you couldn't build it. It was not allowed in the zoning. And Minneapolis became, and St. Paul became one of the first cities in recent history to ban that, to say we aren't going to have this in our zoning laws. We are going to allow to build multifamily homes. The Washington Post in the last month had a headline that was like, the townhome is the new American dream. And I really think it's emblematic of the direction we need to head. So I think across the board, I believe we can, I think Montgomery County, Maryland is a good model for how you protect renters and produce more housing. And there are more there are more models like that across the country that we need to pick up and scale. Because here's the thing, this has been left to localities, since, well, forever. And this was the first election cycle where we saw candidates running on housing. Both of them talked about housing, and Kamala had a real plan with her $25,000 to support, to build more. I think you would have seen a real yes in my backyard contingent in that administration. Perhaps you'll see it in the next administration too, but it's starting to become a federal issue because it's so deeply broken. And I think that is important to creating a real housing guarantee in America.
Yeah. So I want to talk about one more element of the guarantee. Before then, we talk about sort of the political moment we are. Because I have questions from the audience about the Trump era of the second Trump era of politics. But before, one of the things that we talked about just before we started the Zoom was the cost of education and the overhang of student loans, including on older adults. And you had a fact in your book, which was just blew me away.
Yeah, I was tracking. So the way the book works is I track the advocate who, and there are many, many, many advocates who do this work, but I track an advocate that's emblematic of the guarantee and how their work has moved us in that direction. And here I'm tracking Astra Taylor, who has built a union of debtors, including student debtors. And on the day I talked to her, she was like, oh, actually, I'm holding a gathering for elder debtors, elder student debtors, because it turns out that 1 in 4 student debtors is over the age of 50. It's people who've carried debt that long. It's people who are going back to school. It's people who are helping others take out the loans, and that it is really a crisis that is, the aging population, the decline in wages, and the dramatic rise of student debt. So I got on this Zoom and I got to hear from people in their 60s, 70s who had extraordinary amounts of student debt that they owed, who were coming together, who were processing the shame of taking out that debt, of being in that situation, but also the structures and the decisions this nation has made to have that be the norm in this country. That in order to have a higher education, you have to owe hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that was not true at one point in this nation. That at one point it was understood to be a public good, that a nation that invests in its young people to become doctors and nurses and entrepreneurs and scientists, that would be a nation investing in the long haul. And all of that changed during this era I've been talking about, the 80s. And California, where I sit, was really the tip of the spear when Ronald Reagan was governor here. So it was the 70s, the 80s, all of that started to shift. And it's something we now, take out on our own backs, the debt in order to finance this. So I found that the fact that 1 in 4 student debtors were elders was something I hadn't understood at all.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary fact. So let's actually talk about sort of the moment and the politics of this, because I think that's what when I was reading your book, which was written before the election. Let's acknowledge that. Some of it seemed out of step. At least could argue out of step with sort of the moment we're in. And that's one of the questions that's come from the audience. Said, I love your ideas, especially getting human needs off the private market with the incoming administration that has countered everything you're saying and will pull the rug out from any movement towards the guarantees you talk about. And you can address whether you think that's right or not. Yes, states, counties, communities can take action, but I think it'll be doubly difficult. Do you have any suggestions for entities to take action on their own? So what can you sort of react to that sort of lot in there, a lot in that question and statement?
Yeah, I mean, it's one I wake up thinking about every morning. I think several things. One is that, Economic Security Project and the modern guaranteed income movement was born in 2016. And that was a period of time where Republicans held the House, the Senate, and the presidency. Donald Trump had just gotten elected. And a lot of organizations who are focused on building economic support and security were rushing to do defense work, understandably. to support people who were, were being kicked off the rolls for the existing services, Medicaid, so forth, to support undocumented families being targeted. But there were also a set of people who were building and dreaming and imagining, like almost as if a freedom to say, you know what, this wasn't working. This last 40 years of an economy, and voters just told us that in 2016. And voters just told us that again in 2020 and 2024. That the economy wasn't working for them. And so there's almost a freedom in saying it is time to build something entirely different. And so that's where the guaranteed income movement got its birth. Will it be harder? Absolutely. Does it mean it's not going to, we were geared up to pass the expanded child tax credit. It's next year. Will that happen? Probably not. But it will and could happen in 4 to 6, 8, 10 years. This is a long-term fight. And I think the point of the book that we talked about earlier is that it's been a long-term fight. And there are more people now saying this doesn't work than there were in the past. And so that's where I get my hope from. That said, I also think that Donald Trump also doesn't govern like somebody who in the era of
like anyone, let's just say
economics.
he's governed like
He's out there talking about tariffs. That is not a neoliberal policy, right? He's out there talking about building factories right here and like showing up to the photo op where he this is back in the 2016, 2017 era, but he puts the stake in the ground. Those are not neoliberal ideas. And so I do think that there is openings for for the role government plays. That said, I don't feel very optimistic about the next.
I mean, can I actually push back on that? Even the modest positive, the glass a tenth full notion there. I mean, partially, Donald Trump, I'll editorialize, doesn't have a coherent economic platform, but to the extent there is, it's smaller government. Let's cut 3 trillion. Let's get Doge to cut 3 trillion in expenses. Let's lower taxes, and that's what won. That's a moment that reflects what I don't know what's going to happen, but that reflects, I think, that's what people voted for. And that reflects a lack of faith in government solving problems. And that's, I think, a challenge to sort of the vision that you're describing in the guarantee. Not who's right or wrong, but where the weight of public opinion is moving, although pendulums swing all the time.
Actually, I agree that that's what people voted for. I also think people voted for a strong man who was saying, I see your economic pain. I know this isn't working for you. Now I'm going to scapegoat it on these communities, right? I'm going to tell you it's immigrants' fault who are taking your job and your housing, right? That was a big reason that it was understood to be a cultural issue, but it was an economic issue for Donald Trump. And I'm gonna fix it for you. I'm gonna make America great again. I think that's what people were voting for, which is actually a really different role of government than the one that had been sold over the last 40 years. Now, at the same time, this is what he's masterful at. He speaks to the working class, but his first year in office in 2017, he passed tax cuts that gave the richest people in the world the lowest tax rates ever, right, in American history. He passed tax cuts that lowered the corporate tax rates anytime since 1929. And that has driven up the debt, and that is a sort of a noose that we all have lived with for the past 10 years. And so that, unfortunately, is what we are poised to get more of. But I do think people were also hearing him say, this isn't working, and something, that I'll take care of it for you. And so I'm hopeful that there's a space that opens up for a different kind of candidate, a candidate who truly believes in building support for working families to step forward and challenge this.
One of the things that, as I was reading your book, I had sort of flashbacks because things that actually happened relatively recently I'd completely forgotten about. So one of the things you framed up was the 2020 Democratic primaries where, even though they didn't win, Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders were kind of ascendant, and their view, their view of kind of the guarantee was driving the Democratic primaries, and others had to at least nod to it if they wanted to win. That feels like a long time ago. I mean, it feels it's only 5 years ago, and things I think reflects how fast things can change. But it also feels like a long time ago. Do you think the pendulum has swung for the moment away from your view, and what would it take to swing it back?
Mm. I think the pendulum has shifted. I don't know if it's entirely swung, and here's why. Think of Cory Booker running for president in 2020. He ran on one of the guarantees that is the guarantee of inheritance, right? It's called a baby bond. And this is the idea that every child born in this country should have a trust held for them that they can access when they turn 18, just like a child from a wealthy family would have. And that with that trust, they can start a business, they can buy a home, they can get a degree. A trust, right? A guaranteed inheritance, a baby bond. And since Cory Booker ran for president on that guarantee, the state of Connecticut has passed it. Washington, D.C. has passed baby bonds. The state of California has passed baby bonds in the surplus year right after COVID. There are a number of other states that are actively working to pass it, Massachusetts, Vermont. So it's like the pendulum swung away from the national headlines that are sort of sexy and designed to be clicked on toward the like less interesting but more important work of getting it done, of making it happen, of creating the prototype. That the next time the pendulum swings, it will be there and can be scaled. And that's true guarantee after guarantee.
So it's interesting the examples you pick there. Connecticut, DC, California, all very blue areas. We've talked about Washington State, and they're occasionally mentioned in your book and elsewhere. Minimum wage passes in Mississippi and a few other places, but by and large, you're talking about the progress that has been made has occurred in uh, sort of more liberal, wealthier parts of the country. Are you worried about essentially a two-tier country in which uh, nothing happens on the national stage, but progress is made in wealthier, more liberal communities?
I'm very worried about a two-tiered country for many, many reasons, including economic ones. But I also know that time after time, when people are asked to vote for themselves directly on economic issues, they vote for it. So this cycle, we saw a number of red states. Nebraska, the 2 red states passed an increase in minimum wage and another passed paid sick leave. Those were ballot measures that people could vote on directly, and they did. So I also think, and poll after poll shows, this is actually what people want. So I'm hopeful that there will be a different type of Republican who emerges in this sort of chaotic moment for the Republican Party to move that forward in the same way you're seeing a lot of Democrats doing that too, that across both sides of the aisle, you will see candidates who are responsive to these economic issues.
So the 2 more questions. We're coming to, and I'm sorry, at the end of a fascinating conversation. Thank you, Natalie, for this. But as I promised, as I both predicted and promised everyone, we'll end at the end at the hour. You talked a lot about in the book about COVID and it being a moment of sort of guarantees. And I actually think it's worth actually reminding people that many of the things you talked about actually happened in COVID out of emergency legislation, and many of them came very close to being permatized. I don't know if that's a word or not, but let's say it is. But didn't. Fell 1 vote short in many cases. We even know who that 1 vote was. What do you take? So can you just sort of describe sort of the fact that we almost had sort of a new economic foundation coming out of COVID, but didn't quite get there? And is that a sort of a moment lost until the next crisis, that we wasted a crisis that we couldn't afford to waste?
Yeah, that we wasted a crisis. I actually don't know if we did waste the crisis. Let me explain. You know, it's actually Milton Friedman himself that that it's only in a crisis, whether real or perceived, that good ideas that are lying around, they get picked up and they get moved forward. And that is how progress is made. And that is what we saw in the pandemic. That thanks to the hard work of the advocates I track and many others, there were these good ideas lying around that, unlike the recession in 2008, that we picked up these ideas and we moved them forward. We passed the expanded child tax credit, right? We passed rental assistance to help keep people in their homes and an eviction moratorium. That we passed we mobilized the National Guard to put free vaccines in people's arms in massive parking lots across the country. These are things unimaginable. Housing advocates had the money to buy hotels outright and moved the unhoused in, giving people who had been sleeping on a tent a key to a room of their own with a roof over their heads. Like, this was the big ideas that moved forward during this time. And I actually think a part of the economic pain that we hear poll after poll at the ballot box is because people experienced just a taste of something different, and then it was taken away. And that feels terrible. We know that the psychology of taking something away is worse than giving something in the first place. So I think that's one thing. But the second thing I'll say is that the way to think about it is we have a blueprint now. So the next crisis that comes along, we know how to do this. These things are possible. They've been done. There are experts that exist. The research is out there. We know how to do it again. And the third thing I'll say is that we have, recovered as a nation so much faster than other countries who didn't do this. And so there's real economic evidence to continue investing in moments of crisis like this. But how we define crisis matters. I would argue that the likely upheaval in the American workforce, right? The fact that Hollywood could easily become a ghost town with the technology that exists on the shelf today is a crisis that we should address, right? The crisis of loneliness, the fact that we are deeply disconnected because we have no time or energy to be with one another, no civic institutions pulling us together, right? These are crises. Let's name them such, and then let's roll out the blueprint we have and make it a reality again.
All right, so last question for you, Natalie. As I read the book, I was actually, even though the period the book covers is only really 15 years, sort of a snap of the finger in the history of economics, I was actually sort of shocked by the crazy pendulum swings between 2008 and 2016 and 2020 and 2024. Give us a bold prediction. So we're, people, not everyone, half the country's happy, half the country's depressed. For the people who are depressed, give us a bold prediction of what 2028 might look like from progress during the Trump years, and how progress might be made.
Well, I think the first years will be 2025, where you have gubernatorial elections in New Jersey and Virginia that are often sort of the bellwether. So that's coming. And then you have 2026 with the midterm elections. And if history is a gauge, we elected Donald Trump in 2016. In 2018, we took the part of the country that is depressed, took back the House of Representatives. There were a number of seats picked up, and that served as a check on trying to drown government in the bathtub, as it were. I think you don't have to wait 4 years for something to shift. That said, I also think that worldwide, we are seeing a trend toward voting the incumbents out. Whoever was in charge was voted out, right? In the UK, it happened to be the Conservative Party and Labour moved in, but the rest of Europe, it was out with the liberal parties and in with the conservative ones. And that is what we're seeing in America. And until we address what voters are telling us, which is that these institutions and this status quo and this economy is not working for me, then I think we'll continue to see that pendulum swing. That's why I believe we're in the interregnum between economic paradigms, and that I'm hopeful there are now candidates who understand that and who are going to feel a mandate to run on behalf of the people who want something different.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Natalie, for joining us today. for a great conversation. And again, the book is The Guarantee: Inside the Fight for America's Next Economy. And I think producer Emma has put details about where to find the book and where to find out more about Natalie and her work. And we have lots more coming in the coming months. We're not having a book club in January because January 22nd and 23rd is our annual Century Summit, which this year will focus on ageism and the promise in the intergenerational future. The link for that for registration should also be in the chat. And finally, our next book club event will be in February 13th at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, when Martha, who will be with me next time, and I will be talking with Stacy Torres from the University of California, San Francisco, on her forthcoming book, At Home in the City, Growing Old in Urban America. I hope everyone has a happy holidays and hope to see you at all our conversations in 2025.
Thanks so much, Ken.
Thank you, Dan.